So I'm starting this series of watercolor for beginners, and this is going to be the first video, and it's going to be all about what supplies you need. We're going to talk about what paints you need to get started and all of that fun stuff in this video. Then in other videos, I'm going to talk about water control and how to do different washes, how to do gradients. We're going to do a video on color mixing, so learning to mix different colors. This is especially great if you've chosen a smaller set of colors to work with. And we're going to go through different skills. And at the very end of this, we're going to do a artwork all together. So I'll have a real-time tutorial and you guys can paint along with me. And hopefully by the end of this course, you'll feel comfortable to jump in with me and paint along. So because I want these videos to be pretty in-depth, they are going to be a little bit longer and I am going to have to break them up because I feel like you just can't squeeze this all into one like 20-minute or half-hour video. You're just not going to learn anything. So with all of that said, we're just going to jump right into today's video. So we're going to start off with what papers to get. Now I hear a lot of people saying that they start with Canson paper, and I'm going to go ahead and stop you right there and say, if you're wanting to do the same techniques that somebody else is using and they're using really good paper like this Arches paper, you're never going to be able to achieve that with cheaper paper. So I think paper is one of the most important things when starting with watercolors, and that's why I always go ahead and recommend the Arches paper. Now I've got both blocks and pads of paper here, and the difference is a block of paper just comes on a block and it is glued on 3 sides, and there's a little space here where you can get the paper off. Now this is great, especially if you're doing wet and wet, which we will touch on in another video, because it really holds the paper down and you're not going to get that buckling or waving. Now if you're using a paper pad like this, I always suggest to go ahead and tape the edges of it down, and that will help with some of the buckling, but you'll still get a little bit of it. Now I've got cold pressed here and hot pressed of both. My preference with watercolor is always cold pressed. I find with hot pressed, I can't get things to blend out as nicely. So this was done with the Arches cold pressed. And as you can see, just the transitions between different colors are nice and soft. And this one here was done on the hot pressed. And as I put the color down, it immediately like stuck to the paper. So as I was trying to blend out these edges, they just won't blend. Whereas the cold pressed, everything will blend and soften together. So that's why I do prefer the cold press. Now, if I'm using colored pencils, hands down, it's going to be my hot pressed paper. So I suggest experiment, but if you want to do a lot of wet and wet rather than very detailed pieces, I would definitely tend to go towards the cold pressed paper. But if you want to do a lot of little detail and do more dry on dry, then the hot pressed is going to be great for you. But just be aware that you're not going to be able to blend things out as nicely on the hot pressed paper. Now, one thing I do want to mention real quickly when I'm talking about good quality paper is you want to look for 100% cotton paper. This is going to mean that your water is really going to soak into the paper, and it's going to give you more time to work with your watercolor. Now, papers like the Canson watercolor paper, it's not 100% cotton, so the water's never really going to soak into the paper. It's always going to stay on the surface. So that's why you'll notice you'll get weird blending. You'll get a lot more blooming because the water's very wet. So as you're adding more paint to it, everything just sort of mixes and blooms and does weird things. And that's because it sort of has this like layer in between the paper and the water. Whereas cotton paper, everything just soaks into it and blends really nicely and smoothly. So just keep that in mind. Now, my second favorite watercolor has to be this Academy watercolor paper pad. This is also cold pressed and it's also 100% cotton. Now, I would say this is a little bit more towards like your student grade paper. Even though it's 100% cotton, this is much more affordable than your Arches, and it is still pretty textured. Arches is very textured, and this is still textured too. So if you like to do stuff like dry brushing or wet and wet, this is still a really great paper. Now, I did this little bunny rabbit on this paper, and as you can see, we're still able to blend out and get a really nice blend, but I can also go in and get some details on top of this paper. So it's also a really nice one. And I do suggest this a lot for students because this is a little bit more affordable to your Arches paper. So if you want to sort of try it out and just see how you like doing the wet on wet, then this is definitely a good paper for that. Now, this is my third favorite paper, and this is the Strathmore 500 series cold pressed paper. And it's important that it's the 500 series because this is also 100% cotton. Now, one thing I really like about these papers is that they're actually cut to size. So if you want to frame something as an 8x10, this is actually an 8x10, whereas most of the watercolor blocks you're going to get are 7x10. So you're going to have a little bit of a gap there that you're either going to have to put a mat to fill in that space or cut your artwork smaller to fit a smaller frame size. But I really like this. So I have the 5x7 and the 8x10, but I know it comes even larger, I think 11x14. Now this piece was done on this. So as you can see, I just taped this down onto my desk. I did wet and wet, so it does a really nice blending job in the background, but I'm also able to go over it and get some really nice details. Now, I was able to get some really nice fine lines because this is probably the least textured paper out of all of them. So if you want to do some wet on wet, but get really fine details, I find this is a great paper to choose. And this is actually becoming one of my favorites. I'll try to link anything that's sort of like watercolor related down below for resources for you guys. But as you can see, it did a pretty good job not buckling, and I put a lot of water on and a lot of paint on this background. Now, as a bonus watercolor paper, I wanted to throw in this Paul Rubens cold pressed watercolor paper. Now, this is 100% cotton, but be careful because it doesn't really say anywhere that it is other than on the site. So I write it in here that it's 100% cotton because I also have one of their 50% cottons, which aren't quite as nice. But this one is pretty nice, and I also like it because it's fairly large. It's a little bit larger than the other ones, 7.6 by 10.6. So you have just a little bit more space. Now this is sort of a in-between texture, I would say in between Arches and the Academy. And this was a piece that I did on this block. Now, this is using Cotman watercolors. Now, if you know Cotman watercolors, they're a little bit less vibrant than the professional ones from Winsor and Newton, but look how nice and vibrant these colors are. Now, this is just one layer in the background, and then I splattered on top. But one thing I find about this paper, and I don't know what it is it really brings the brightness and the saturation of your colors out. So if you like to do really nice bright pieces of this, I find it just keeps those colors so nice and bright. So I was really impressed when I found this out about this paper. So that's sort of like a secret tip for you guys. Now let's talk about brushes. Now I have an array of different brushes here, and I'm going to show you the ones that I reach for the most and which ones I wouldn't suggest. So my hands down absolute favorite brush that I recommend to everybody are these silver black velvet brushes. Now I have a size 12 here, a size 8, and a size 4. You can get this in a 3 set like this, and to be honest, these are the only 3 brushes that you will ever need to do most of your painting. Now, if you can't afford the 3 brushes, because these are a little bit of an investment, they are more expensive than any brushes, but I've had these for years. But as you can see, they still have such nice tips on them. But if you could only afford one brush to try, I would start with the size 8 silver black velvet. Now, I like this brush because it's so versatile. It's still pretty big, so depending if you paint up to like a size 9 by 12, I would say this is going to do it for you. If you want to paint larger than that, then you might want to go with a bigger brush. One thing I really like about these brushes is they hold a lot of water and they hold a lot of paint, so you don't really have to be constantly going back in and reloading your brush, which makes your painting process go a little bit faster. So that's one thing I really like about these. Another thing is, as you can see, this is a Princeton Neptune 8 round. Now, this one is wet because I was using this, so you can see the tip on that. The other one is not wet at all, but it already has almost the same, if not a finer tip. Let me see if I can find a wet brush here. So I found a size 10 that I was using earlier for painting, and if you just compare the two, my size 10 silver black velvet has a better tip on it than the Princeton Neptune round. So again, if you like to do detail paintings, these are also a great option because they hold such a fine tip that you can really get in there even with a bigger brush and get some really fine lines. So that's another reason I really like these brushes. Now, what do I like the Princeton Neptune rounds for? Now, I started with these brushes, so they're not bad at all, but they don't hold as much water and they don't hold as much paint. So you're gonna have to go in and keep dipping in a little bit more often than you would with the other ones. However, these are a little bit more affordable, so keep that in mind too. And I find these are a really great brush to start with, and then you can sort of branch out and, you know, experiment with other brushes. Now, I would suggest to start with round brushes, and no matter what brand you get, I always suggest to start with a 12, an 8, and something smaller, like a size 4 or a size 2, just depending on what type of brush you have. The bigger ones might not hold as nice of a point, so you might need to get a smaller brush, but I would say start with those 3 brushes, and then you should be able to do most of your painting. Now, as you get going, you might want to add on some other brushes. So I really like this 3/4 flat brush, and I use this to wet a lot of my backgrounds. Because this will hold a lot of water, I can wet my background really quickly and then just jump right into painting. Now, another type of brush that I would look into getting if you want very little tiny details would be a liner brush like this. So if you notice that whatever smaller brush you got just doesn't do it enough for you, then you could always look at getting a liner brush, and it's just got a longer tip on it, and it'll come to a finer point so that you can get long little wispy lines. These are really great if you want to do whiskers, or if you're doing long grass or something like that. These are really great for that. Another specialty brush that I have here is this filbert grass comb. Now, each brush like this is going to be called something a little bit different, but what it is, it's a filbert, but there's little spaces in between all of the hairs. So if you think of a filbert like this, where it's round, a comb like this, or a grass comb, it's going to have little spaces in between each of the hairs. And what this does is when you paint it, it's going to leave like little lines. So if you want to go on top and create detail, like I did with that bunny painting, and we created some of that fur detail in that, I used a brush like this for a lot of that. So I'll lay the hair down like that. So if you want to do a lot of animal pieces, then this might be a brush to look into. But again, this isn't something I would start with. Now, I've also got this scrubber brush here, and I've recently really started liking this. So I've used this to do some bokeh looks in the background, where I take a stencil and then I'll go over top and scrub some of my watercolor off and pat it dry, and it just lightens that area so you can get a little bit of a bokeh look. Or if I've gone over my subject with the background colors, I can take this scrubber brush and scrub that area and dab it off, and it just sort of like gets rid of the watercolor that's gone over. Now, depending on what type of paper you're using, you want to be very careful. Arches can handle a lot of scrubbing. Some of the other papers, like the Strathmore that I mentioned, can only handle a little bit of scrubbing before that paper starts to lift off. So just keep that in mind as well. Now, some other brushes that I want to mention here are these Simply Simmons and this Grumbacher brush. Now, this is supposed to be a watercolor brush, or at least that's where I found it, but I do not like this for watercolor at all. It's a very stiff brush, so it's got a lot of snap to it, but I find you can't get a lot of different like variation in your strokes when you're doing it. It sort of just does the same stroke. And I find it also doesn't hold hardly any water or pigment at all. So you're constantly going in and picking up more. So brushes that I recommend are definitely more soft brushes. So I don't know if you can see how just soft that is compared to this one. Like this is very stiff, whereas this isn't. So you're going to get a lot more variation in the strokes, whereas this, you know, you don't really have too much variation. And the Princeton brushes are also very soft as well. Now, the Simply Simmons is the same. It's very hard. It's not going to hold a lot of water or anything. So I wouldn't recommend brushes like this where it's pretty stiff. So I also have these Paul Rubens brushes here, but I don't really use these that much. One thing I don't like about them is they hold a lot of water. So they'll hold a lot of water and a lot of paint, but depending how you paint, if you like to, you know, dry your brush off and lift up some of the paint, or go on top and do some dry brushing, then these brushes are not going to be for you, because they're just going to hold too much water to be able to do that. So before we get into what paints to start off with, I just want to talk a little bit about palettes. Now, depending if you get your paints in tube form or in pan form, which is going to be more in a palette like this, it's going to depend what palette you want to choose. So some companies will offer, you know, ready-made palettes like this, where you'll open it up and then you already have all of your paints in here ready to go, and you can just use this palette. Now, one thing I don't like about these palettes is the mixing areas are quite small. So I always suggest having like some other type of palette or dish off to the side that you can mix in, because how often are you going to just use this little spot if you're doing a background color? Not often. Now, your other option would be just to buy these little plastic pieces, get your watercolors in the tube, and then you can fill them up in here and have your watercolors still in a palette like this. So this is one option. Now the option that I use is I like a bigger palette like this. So I've got all of my watercolors in the palette here, and then I've got a nice big mixing space here. Now, you know I like these palettes a lot because I think I have 4 of them at this point, and I've also just gotten a new smaller one, and I'm going to talk about this one in a second. But I like this because I can just sort of lay the color down in here. I let them dry overnight, and then I'm ready to paint with them. And I can sort of just take my brush and just pull out a little bit of color as I need it. And then I do all of my color mixing and everything in this palette here. Another nice thing about this palette is all of the palettes can come out. So this one can come out and you can have another mixing space here. And this one also will come out and you can have another mixing space there. So if you want to like set this up over here or somewhere else, you can do that. And then you can just put everything back together and close it up. So these are really nice and convenient. Now, these hold a lot of watercolor. So when you're first starting out, you might not need this many spaces. And I did leave some spaces in between just in case I wanted to pick up other colors. But you definitely don't need this many colors, as we're going to talk a little later on. Now, sort of a happy medium palette that I think I've decided on is sort of a little palette like this, where it still gives you some mixing space. And what my plan for this is to fill it up with like warm colors on this side, cool colors on this side. And then I'll have a little bit of mixing space here and some mixing space here. So this will be a further video down the road once I choose what colors I want to go in here, because I have a few different brands that I'll touch on a little bit later in this video. So I sort of want to pick my favorite colors from each brand and fill this palette. So again, if you only have a few colors starting out, you might want to get a smaller palette like this and then just add colors as you want more convenient colors. Now, some other supplies for watercolor that I want to touch on is just a few things here. So obviously you need some jars of water if you're going to do watercolor. So I like to have 2 jars. I have one for clean water and one for dirty water. And that way I can always make sure if I need to get some nice fresh water, I've got it in here. Or I keep the bigger one for my dirty water. And that just helps me keep my mixes clean, because I can always be going into my clean water to get fresh water to mix some new paint. And then I find having a big enough jar like this just allows me to wash my brushes off easily enough. And then once I'm done painting, I'll still go ahead and rinse them under the sink just to make sure that all of the paint is out of them. And then I just go ahead and reshape them. So I'll just take my fingers and reshape the point. Now, another thing I want to talk about is these microfiber cloths. Now, I really love these cloths, and when you hear me say I'm just dabbing my brush off, I'm literally just dabbing my brush off onto the cloth here. And that just gets rid of some of the water or some of the pigment that's in my paint, but you could always have a piece of paper towel and do that off to the side as well, so dab it off onto that. But I really like these microfiber cloths because I've had this one going for months and months and months, and I just keep like folding it onto a different side, and then every once in a while when it's completely full, I'll just take it under the sink and just rinse it out under the sink, let it dry, and it's good to go. So I have a couple of these always on the go. Now, another thing I want to talk about that a lot of people don't mention is gouache. So I will use black gouache and white gouache in my paintings. You can go ahead and try to save the white of the paper, or you can use something like masking fluid. Now, this Winsor and Newton yellow masking fluid is my favorite, and having it yellow just makes it a little bit easier to see where it is on the paper. But this is definitely my favorite, but I still like to go in with my gouache. If I need like a very dark area, I'll use the gouache, or if I need light areas, or if I want to go on top, make snowflakes or anything like that, I will use gouache. And my favorite black is the M Graham Lamp Black. And then I sort of go between the M Graham Titanium White and the Winsor and Newton Permanent White. These two are pretty much similar, so I'm just using up my M Graham one now, and then I obviously have a big tube of this one. So honestly, I just use whichever one I grab first, but those are my favorite. So I will go in and just add like little tiny highlights at the end of the painting or lighten any areas up. But you can also mix this into your watercolor. If you want to mix like a lighter or more opaque version of that color, you can certainly go ahead and do that. I don't do that a lot, but that's an option for you. Now, I wouldn't use this lamp black gouache instead of the watercolor black. And the reason being is this watercolor is still pretty translucent. So you can still water this down and mix it in with other colors, although I'll show you a better way to mix darker colors rather than just going in and mixing with a black in the next video. But you can certainly use that to mix in and darken some colors. But if you were to go in with the gouache black, it's just so opaque it would overpower any of your mixes. And so I use this more to go on top if I'm doing like a silhouette painting. So here for this painting, I used the black gouache to go on top of the elk here, and to do the bottom, and to do the leaves. So it's very opaque, so it's going to cover over top of everything else, and it's nice and matte black, which I love about that. But I'm able to still get these little details and stuff, so that's typically what I'll use black gouache for, is just to go on top. If I want to do a silhouette painting or some sort of style like this, then that's what I use it for. And I use the white gouache to do the stars in the background and to do his breath as well. So you can still use those in combination. So that's why I wanted to, you know, touch on them in this video. But yeah, these are just sort of some add-on items, but I mean, the jars of water are pretty important. Now, these are all of the watercolor tubes that I have collected over the last few years. And I say collected because I did not get this all at one time. I do not suggest that. This is way too many colors for anybody. But I like to try different things and try different brands. So these are the main brands that I use right now. Now, the very first watercolors I ever started with were my Cotman watercolors here. And I just collected these. I would go to Michael's and buy, you know, a tube here and there whenever they were on sale, and I just collected them, and that's what I started with. And then I went ahead and picked up the M-Gram 10 set, and I'll go ahead and put a picture of it here on the screen for you guys. The next watercolors that I got into were the Daniel Smith watercolors, and I wanted to try these because a lot of them will granulate, so it's just like texture in the watercolor, whereas a lot of the other ones are quite smooth. But I wanted to go ahead and try these out, and I got the Jean Hines set, so I'll go ahead and put that on the screen right now as well. So I got that to start with, and then I bought a few other colors here and there. And then I found these Winsor and Newton watercolors on sale. So I've just got them in a baggie here, and these are probably between these and the M-Gram, the ones that I use the most right now. So these were on sale for close to 50% off, if not 50% off. So that's why I picked up quite a few of these, and that was in one of my previous hauls. But I wouldn't have gotten that many if I wasn't getting such a good deal. Now, I just want to show you some color swatches for each brand and just touch on a few different things from each brand. And then I'm going to go ahead and show you what colors you should probably start with, and then you can branch out from there. So this is the color swatches from the M-Grams. Now, one thing you're going to notice is these colors are very vibrant. They're very pigmented as well. They're light fast, especially the permanent alizarin crimson, because most alizarin crimsons aren't permanent, so that's why this one is a permanent alizarin crimson. So if you're selling your watercolor artwork, you want to make sure that your colors are going to be permanent. So one thing I find about the M-Gram watercolors is some of their colors flow a little bit more, and what that means is if you wet the paper with water and then you put the color down, it's how far that color bleeds out. And I find M-Gram bleeds out quite a bit compared to like your Winsor and Newton watercolors. And I would say the Daniel Smith probably bleeds out the second most amount. And the Winsor and Newton ones, both the Cotman and the Professional, are pretty good at staying in place, and they just sort of soften out. So keep that in mind. If you want like nice, like feathery backgrounds, then you can definitely go with the M-Gram. Now, the drier that you use the paint when you're doing wet on wet, the less it's going to spread out, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that in another video, but just keep that in mind when choosing your watercolors. So then we've got the Daniel Smith swatches here. Now, Daniel Smith does come with a set. I think there's 6 different colors in it, so you get 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues. Now that is a great starter set for beginners, except the only thing is the French ultramarine that comes in that set is very granulating. And so that means you're going to get that little texture in almost all of your mixes, anything that you're using the blue in. And it can kind of look a little weird if you're doing mixes between some other colors that don't granulate versus like you add a purple with the French ultramarine and then it granulates, and so you've got areas where it don't and do, and it just depends if you like that look. So that's definitely a great starter set to get, is those 6 colors, but just be aware that the French ultramarine does granulate, and so whether you like that or not, keep that in mind. Now this is the Winsor and Newton Professional and the Winsor and Newton Cotman. And you're going to see I have a lot more Cotman colors than I do from anything else, because those were the ones that I started with, and I just started picking up different colors to, you know, try out. Now, one of the differences between the Professional and the Cotman version, which is like your student brand, is the student ones use a lot more hues. So that just means they're not going to be as pigmented as the professional brand. But a lot of the same colors are still light fast throughout both sets. So that's something to keep in mind. But I find if you look at the difference between swatches, a lot of these colors are just going to be a little bit less pigmented than the professional version because they have more binders in them rather than more pigment. So that's just one big difference. So if you look at this dioxazine violet, you're just going to notice that this one has a lot more pigment in it, whereas this one's just a little bit softer in color. But to be honest, the Cotman watercolors are still really great to start with. So if you wanted to start with the least amount of colors, I've picked 6 colors here that would be great starter colors. Now I did pick from the Cotman's watercolors because yes, I started with them, but they're a really great brand to start with. They're affordable, they have a really nice color range, they're light fast still, so it's really great to start with, and then you can always branch out and add more brands. But if you wanted to go ahead and jump right into a professional brand right away, then just go ahead and pick some colors that are similar. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about a primary versus a split primary palette, and this would be considered a split primary palette. A primary would just be one yellow, one red color, and one blue color. But I like the split primary because you get a warm and cool of each. So it gives you a lot more mixing options. So if we look at here at the yellows, I've got the lemon yellow, which is a cool yellow. So this is going to help mix really nice greens. We've got cadmium yellow hue. You could also use the cadmium yellow deep hue. It's just a little bit more deep. I just don't have that one. So this is going to be great mixing like oranges and warmer colors. Then we've got permanent rose and cadmium red deep hue. Now I didn't pick alizarin crimson, and you see that in a lot of palettes, and I'll let you know why I didn't pick that color. Now alizarin crimson is a little more on the cool side, so I've picked the permanent rose instead. So for one reason, the permanent rose is permanent, it's light fast, and it's also a cool color, so it's going to mix great purples for us. Now the cadmium red deep hue is a nice true warm red, and that's going to help us when we want to mix orange colors. Now I didn't pick the alizarin crimson because one, it's not permanent, it's not light fast, so it will fade over time, but if we mix these two colors together, we'll get something that's pretty darn close and close enough, but it'll be light fast. Now the alizarin crimson in the professional brand as well, as far as I know, is not light fast. I'm not sure if they have a permanent alizarin crimson or not, but I'll let you know down below. If not, you could always try the M-gram one because that one is permanent and it will last. And also from the alizarin crimson, no matter how much you water it down, you're not going to get a real true pink color. So this permanent rose sort of does twofold here. It also gives us that light pinky color if you need it. Now the two blues that I've picked are cerulean blue hue and ultramarine. So you can see them here, cerulean blue hue and ultramarine. Now there is a lot of debate over ultramarine, whether it's warm or whether it's cool. But if we just look at this color wheel here, and if we go down towards the greens, so we can definitely tell that cerulean blue hue has more green in it. So this one's going to help us mix better greens. Whereas if we go up and we're seeing a little hint of like that purple in the blue, so the ultramarine leans a little more purple, that's going to help you make better purples. So that's how you can kind of distinguish between some colors, is use your color wheel. Because if we put this blue violet up to the cerulean blue hue, it's obviously quite different. Whereas if we put it up to the ultramarine, it's pretty darn close. So because it leans more violet, we're going to get better violets. This one leans more green, we're going to get better greens. So that's how I see it. And you can do this with any colors. So if we look at the cadmium red deep hue, it leans a little bit more orangey red, whereas the permanent rose leans a little bit more purpley red. So of course this is going to give us better purples than our cadmium red hue. Now in the next video, we're going to get all into color mixing and showing you how to put these colors into practice to mix some of the other colors. So how to mix your greens, your purples, other colors. But if you have the money and you just want to go in and get a couple of other convenient colors, I'm just going to show you some colors that I would recommend. Now you can mix black, but it is very difficult, and especially for beginners, because technically you need to mix all three of the primaries to get a black. And so when you're not used to that, it's very hard to get the right consistency, and it's either going to be a little too warm or a little too cool. So if you know that you're going to use black a lot, then I would say just go ahead and get it. Another option that you could do is take burnt sienna, and if you mix burnt sienna with ultramarine, you're going to get a very dark gray, but it's never going to be quite black. So you could go ahead and mix these two. If you don't really necessarily need a black, you could leave that one out and mix your burnt sienna in with your ultramarine, and you're going to get a gray that's pretty darn close to neutral tint and Payne's gray, but it's never going to be very, very dark. Now the last two colors that I would suggest getting is dioxazine purple and hooker's green, and these are just really convenient colors because no matter how much you're going to mix your ultramarine with your permanent rose, you're never going to quite get it as perfect as just dioxazine violet. And if you just want a quick purple that you know you're going to use all the time, it's very convenient to have it in its own tube. And same with hooker's green. It's very easy to make like a sap green and different versions of sap green, but to get a true hooker's green, it's a little bit difficult, and you might need to add a little bit of red into your mix, and then if you add too much red, it's going to completely mute it down, which we'll talk about in the next video. So that might be another convenient color for you. So if you add all of these colors together, that gives you a 10 color palette set, and then you can always add on colors as you go. And I think this is a pretty darn good start, but again, if you just want the bare minimum, I would say go with these 6 colors. Now these colors go for any brand that you pick. They should have something that's named the same, if not very close. So this is a really good starting point. So keep in mind with every brand, there'll be little bits of color variation in between. So if you get a permanent rose from another brand, it might not look exactly like this. And I'm going to show you with the hooker's green here. So this is the Winsor and Newton Professionals. And if we look at the hooker's green from the Cotman set and from the Professionals, this is a lot more warmer, whereas the hooker's green from the Cotman set is a lot more cooler. So just keep in mind that everyone is a little bit different. And again, here's a difference between sap green. So this is the Cotman sap green, Winsor and Newton Professional, and M. Graham sap green. So you can see each one is slightly different. So keep that in mind, but I'm going to show you in the next video how you can take these base colors, mix them to mix all of your other colors, and then I'm going to also show you how to change them. So if it's a little bit too bright, how to get that muted down. What colors are you going to use to do that? So if you want to see that video, then make sure you subscribe, hit the like so I know that this was helpful for you, and make sure you hit the notification bell so you're notified when I post those videos. I'm going to be doing this series, hopefully 1 video a week, and then I'll put them all into a playlist when I'm done so that you guys can easily go back and reference them. But I hope you see just from this first video how much I'm putting into it, because I really want there to be a lot of information in here for you so you know exactly what you're getting into and what you're going to do with your supplies. Now, before I end this video, I figured we should just get into a little bit of starting to play with your watercolors. So I'm going to show you how to swatch them out, and then I'm going to show you, how to play around with your brushes a little bit and get some different effects. So that's what we're going to do real quick here, and then in the next video we'll go deep into color mixing. So I like to do these little swatch charts like this where I have however many little spots there are in my palette, and then as I put the colors in on the palette, that's how I like to swatch them out on this sheet. So I do suggest making up little swatch pages like this, and this is on the Arches paper because I like to see how my colors are going to look on the paper that I'm going to use. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to use the Etcher cold pressed sketchbook, and this is 100% cotton as well. This is a really great sketchbook and one of my favorites for watercolor. I'm going to take my Princeton Neptune round brush here, and this is just a size 8. And I'm just going to show you how I go about swatching them. So we'll pick a couple of the colors. This is the lemon yellow hue. And what I do is I do a concentrated bit of the pigment at the top, and then I'll go in and rinse that off and just let the water drip off the side of the cup. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but I just sort of get any excess water off of the brush. And then I come down at the bottom and work my way up into this pigment. And I just want to start pulling it down so that I get this nice soft gradient. And that's how I do it. And if you want just a little bit more at the top. And that's sort of how I get my gradients. So maybe we'll do the cadmium red deep hue, which is this one. And you can see just how easily these Cotman watercolors reconstitute, just like, you know, the professional ones. So again, I go about halfway down my swatch area, getting all of that excess water out of my bristles. I come from the bottom up and just slightly go into it a little bit and then start pulling that color down, just so I get a nice like soft transition. And that's what I've done here. So I can get that soft transition. Now, of course, you're going to get a better transition on this Arches paper just because it really pulls and plays with the water. This dries a little bit quicker, but you can still see we're able to get a nice gradient there. So I would suggest going ahead and doing that with all of your colors so that you can see them out. And then you can start to go ahead and play with them, play with your brushes so you can see what you're able to do. So, you know, start, if you do thick and pull it up, what kind of brush strokes can you get? You know, how thin? So try to take it very thin and then thicker and then thin and thicker. So this is all like little practice stuff that you can start doing. And again, just keep going. And even just keep going with one brush until it's gone. And then if you want to get a little bit lighter value, just dip the end of your brush in ever so slightly into the water and let it trail off, and then keep going. And you're just going to notice that the value is going to get a little bit lighter, and keep playing with that. And the more vertical that your brush is too, the smaller of a line you're going to be able to get, versus if you hold it down and then again dip in and wipe on the side of the brush, you're going to get an even lighter value. Now we have more water to pigment ratio, so this is going to dry slower. This is already starting to dry, so keep that in mind. So that was with the Princeton Neptune 8 round. Now let's go ahead and try it with the Silver Black Velvet 10 round. So again, this one has a really nice tip to it. So I can get a really nice belly and then a really nice tip and a belly and a tip. Now what you've noticed here, this just laid down a lot of pigment in one area. And that's because this holds a lot of water and a lot of pigment. So you can always come and soak that up. If you leave that there, that's going to cause like a little bloom on certain papers, like the Canson paper. That's going to cause a bloom. But just keep doing this. And then practice, you know, how fine you can get this one. So this is a size 10, and look at how fine I can get that. You can even practice like going in and, you know, getting different details, like if you want to do fur or something like that. And this is one of my favorite brushes to do that, so you can just see how easily. And then if I want to get a little bit of a lighter value, but now this is leaving a little bit more water on my paper, so I want to be careful of that. But just play around with it like this, and you can start playing around with like wet on wet. So this is red, but because my water's dirty, but just play around like dropping in some color and see what it does. Let's drop some of this cadmium yellow hue in there with it and just see what that does. You know, just start playing around and making a mess, really, because that's how you're going to learn best, is just making a mess. And, you know, see how you can scrub up the color on your paper. Is it going to lift? You know, you want to test that. Is this going to lift here? That was still a little bit wet. You know, do that, and then take a little Kleenex or a paper towel and kind of dab it off and just see, you know, just really play with your paints. And you want to get used to the brush. You want to get used to like different motions if you have it this way versus this way. And you're always going to be a little bit better, you know, at making flicks one way versus the other way. So like keep that in mind and just play and make different marks and stuff. So that's going to be your homework for the week, is to do your swatches and then just start playing with whatever brushes you have and getting used to them, getting used to how thin you can get it. Do I need to switch down to a smaller sized brush? Because this was our size 10 here, and let's check out our size 2. So you would think for a size 2, oh, you're going to be able to get such a super thin line, and yes, I can. But the difference between the size 2 and the size 10, not a whole lot, because this has such a fine point. You know, so yes, I can get like ultra little fine, you know, details and flicks. And that's what I love this brush for. Or if I'm doing like grass or something, you know, grassy textures, like this is great for that. But that's why you want to just play with your supplies and see what you can do with them. So this is going to be your homework for the week, so to speak. I want you to do your color chart. So have all your different colors out on a chart, or even just a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be super fancy like this, but as long as you have all the colors, and I say write the names down just because you can start associating a name with a color. So do that and then start playing with your brushes and seeing what kind of marks that you can make on the paper. And I would suggest starting to play on the paper that you're going to use, because these marks are going to be quite different on every paper. So if you've got a paper pad that's what you're planning to use, or a paper block, I would start practicing on that. And then next week we're going to jump right into color mixing. So it's all going to be about color mixing and how to mix different colors. And then we're going to touch on how to do different washes, wet on wet, wet on dry, how to do a gradient wash, all different kind of things. So that'll be another video. And we're just going to keep going and keep learning. So I hope you guys are enjoying this series. If you are, make sure to give it a thumbs up, because I am putting a lot into this, because I want it to be super informative for you guys. And make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when I post the other videos in this series. Should be one a week I'm aiming for. And thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye.